All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this Black Hills Information Security webcast. We've got Troy. Oh, geez. I forgot. Wojewoda.
Wojewoda.
You got it.
Nailed it. All right. So he's going to talk about how to abuse DNS. And just want to let you know, when we were creating the graphic and stuff to promote this, I definitely typed in the word abuse into the iStock photo. And that is, if you have seen the image, that's why it's a person sitting around the campfire, because I didn't want to use any of those pictures. All right. So Troy, you're going to do the webcast today. We're going to talk for about 45 to 50 minutes. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions at all, feel free to ask during Zoom, or you could ask in Discord, and your fellow attendees can help you answer. And lastly, if you need a pen test, red team, or threat hunt, you know where to find us.
Or IR. So thanks, Jace. Thanks, Deb. Thanks, David, Ben, and everybody that joined in on the pre-show banter. As Jason said, I'm Troy Wojewoda. I'm here to present about DNS command and control. We're not going to abuse too many things too harshly anyways today. We're going to talk about how attackers have used DNS in some nefarious ways to establish their C2 channels. We're also going to talk about how, as defenders, we can respond to some of that stuff and what it looks like if you haven't seen this before. So thanks for joining, and hope you learned something. Just real quick, kind of before we launch off, I don't know if anybody recognizes the image here at the beginning. We talked a little bit about this before we started the pre-show banter internally at BHIS. If you do know what this icon is, there's a little giveaway at the bottom of the subtitle there. But if you know where this comes from, we're going to talk about it a little bit later in the presentation. But let's get started and talk about how we can utilize, or how attackers have utilized DNS to establish command and control. So a little bit about myself. I already mentioned during pre-show that I've been at BHIS for almost 2 years now. This October will be 2 years. Prior to that, I've had a wide spectrum of different opportunities, if you will, in the Infosec realm. Started off as an intrusion detection analyst way back, probably now 15, 16 years ago. And then kind of worked my way into different areas, different arenas. Did some sysadmin work, but mostly in the in intrusion detection, and starting there and branching out, getting into incident response, and kind of things just took off from there. So I've had the opportunity to have different roles and see how the perspectives are. And the challenges, if you will, differ based off of these different roles within InfoSec. Let's talk about DNS. So why is DNS so attractive? We're going to get into that, and we're going to talk about essentially why this thing that is a protocol that's been around since the early 80s is so relevant, and as far as for just normal traffic, but also how threat actors have utilized this protocol or abused it anyways. We're going to talk about some tools, different techniques that related to DNS, popular campaigns that we've heard about in almost recent news, how to detect it, and lastly, kind of as far as for coming up with detection strategies, what are some of the challenges that we have as far as for responding to as either incident responders or in the say in a forensication or a forensics approach. How do we solve what's going on, or identify and adapt and react to some of this activity. So DNS itself. So I like to say that DNS is the bonding agent of the internet. I mean, it's the protocol in which takes a human text, right? So it's words that we understand as humans and translates them to IP addresses that could be used to route essentially from one computer system to another computer system at the ends of the earth, right? So in simplistic ways, that's essentially what we view DNS for. There's some very interesting attributes with DNS as far as when it comes to the actual protocol structure that we're going to look at, and the fact that it can operate over both the UDP and TCP. In some cases, it's very easy to detect some DNS abuse or command and control over DNS. But then in other cases, that might be very difficult depending on how you're approaching that. So we're going to look at those kinds of things. So again, we're going to talk about some of the infamous attacks or some attacks that threat actors have used in using DNS. But then if you're just curious and you want to kind of read like an academic approach, I have this link in here from Vern Paxson, who actually was the founding person of the Bro IDS, which turned later on to Zeek. And we'll see a little bit more about Zeek later on in the presentation. But there's this interesting article that gets into the actual data science of the protocol itself and how that the bounds, if you will, the limitations and that threat actors, if they're utilizing and abusing DNS, kind of have to operate within. So it's a very good read. Linked it here. DNS itself, as far as for the protocol using it and being abused, right? We talk about in relation to the cyber threat or the cyber kill chain. It's really we're kind of in the phase of command and control, right? So if you're familiar with the cyber threat or the cyber kill chain, Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, you have all the different phases. But command and control is what we're talking about here in this presentation. And I'm referencing MITRE ATT&CK framework, and talks about the threat tactics of particularly just command and control. And specifically, we're gonna talk about how DNS can be used and adversaries, why they use it to blend in with normal traffic. And in doing so, we're gonna discuss a little bit of requests for comments or RFCs. We're going to look at some of the structure, how DNS is made up, and some of that could be a little bit kind of difficult to get through if you spent time reading RFCs and in trying to understand what's going on. If you haven't, you're in a position, say, from a defense perspective, trying to understand the activity in your network, specifically when it comes to network protocols, and you have questions of you're seeing activity, say, and it doesn't make sense. You can always reference these articles, right? These requests for comments, and the ones that are common, the ones that have been adapted over time are going to give you that framework of what the actual protocol, the bounds in which the protocol is expected to operate within. And then that could give you an idea of whether or not what you're seeing is anomalous or not. And it doesn't necessarily mean if it is, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or evil. It means that it's falling outside of those that criteria that makes that protocol what it is, right? The definition of that protocol. And so those are good resources to have. They are hard to get through sometimes when you're looking at and reading out some of these articles. And a lot of these protocols, especially DNS, we're going to talk about, is a very dated protocol, right? It goes back to the early 80s. And some of the things, to understand why the behavior is the way you're seeing, it kind of helps to reference those requests for comments and, understand what the intent is with that protocol, right? Looking at this particular RFC, I just pulled out RFC 1035. Not the first DNS RFC, definitely not the last. There's been many iterations of this specifically to DNS. But I wanted to kind of look at some of the core things that really haven't changed over time. So we look at size limits. So as we're going to see in a little bit, DNS is a very attractive protocol to use to establish command and control because of the ubiquitous and the relevance that it has within your network and within your computer environments. You can't just shut it off. But it's not a protocol that can carry a lot of data, right? Packet perspectives, you're very, very limited, right? It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing or a good thing. It just means that it just is what it is. So kind of understanding what those size limitations are could help us, right? And just understanding what we're looking at. So for example, the size limits. So we talk about labels and names and time to lives. So as mentioned earlier, DNS can be used over both TCP and UDP transport layer protocols. And that's kind of interesting. We don't typically see it over TCP unless you're doing things like zone transfers. But the majority of your DNS in your environment is probably most likely going to be going over UDP. That has its limitations as well, right? It's stateless. That's a set and forget type of protocol. The actual labels themselves. So the labels are if you look at a DNS record or a DNS name, you'll see something like www.google.com. And the labels are everything that's in between the dots. So if you think of like a dot notation kind of perspective of how to understand DNS or the DNS labels, all of those values in between the dots are referred to as labels in the DNS protocol. And there's a restriction. So with those labels comes only 36 or 63 octets or less as a restriction in those labels. The name itself can't exceed 255 octets. So you have limitations there as well set. And then if we actually look at the format here, you could see that we're bounded here within that per packet in that data size that could be fit and per packet wise, right? So again, a very common protocol used throughout networks, but as far as for holding data per packet perspective or per packet instance, a very limited protocol. And then there's the record types. So we're probably all familiar with some of these at the top. Maybe some of them are new to folks. And there's definitely more record types than the ones that are presented here on the slide. These are the kind of most common ones that I've seen over the years of doing incident response and for network forensics or responding to adversarial activity using DNS and some of the DNS tools that are out there to leverage or exploit this protocol. These are the most common ones that I've seen. Not specifically in a particular order, but kind of in a particular order from top to bottom of the ones that are most widely abused. And there's no really shock to that. A records or the quadruple A associated with IPv6. Those are typically what we refer to as forward lookups. Essentially going back to the example of taking a common, human readable name and translating it to an IP address. The most simple examples, www.google.com or whatever.com, the request goes out and then a response comes back. TXT types are extremely popular, especially when we're talking about DNS command and control, because of the format coming back allows this free-form text of data, right? So it doesn't bound us in like what we saw with the labels, what we see in a DNS record label or the actual record size of the DNS going out. Those text records coming back to those DNS responses, those contain much more data that you could fit in there as from text records perspective. But we've seen also these attacker tools and threat actors use stuff like the null resource record, which is a reserved type. CNAME, so CNAME, a canonical name. I like to look at CNAME as kind of like what we look at today and I know it's not one for one, but it's kind of similar to like, I equate it anyways to like on the HTTP side of the house, we talk about URL shorteners, right? Where you have essentially a resource or a reference to another resource. And that's kind of like what a CNAME does. So when we do ask for a request and a CNAME comes back, it's essentially saying, hey, here's more, here's more pointers to the record that you're requesting. So we've seen that used popularly, and then some of these other ones, right? So I did put in here the AXFR, which is a zone transfer type. Typically, as far as for command and control tools, you won't see this as much in like tunneling tools and data upload and download. C2 traditional DNS C2 traditional tools. But it's still something that I wanted to add in here because, essentially if you're monitoring your network and looking at DNS traffic and you see this type of record type and it's not in between domain controllers or any type of DNS servers internally that should be doing zone transfers, this should be something that sticks out. Same thing for like MX records or mail exchange records. Those will exist in your environment if you're sending and receiving email, but clients to servers perspective, you shouldn't be seeing a lot of MX record type things as far as for normal client to server communications. Again, the most popular ones are going to be probably the first two, right? That forward lookups and the text records are going to be your most widely exploited. And the reason being is because they're the most widely used normally. So they blend in the best. So we kind of mentioned the MITRE ATT&CK framework already, but particularly to DNS, kind of call out this specific technique where the adversaries may use DNS obviously to blend in to make it look like normal traffic. DNS is something that's again has been it's widely used throughout your environment. It's something you can't just turn off very easily. If you try to prevent DNS, and there are some things that I'll talk about later that can help you defend against some of this activity. But it's one of those things where if you do it wrong, you break a lot of things. And so a lot of organizations are always kind of, cautionary against doing any kind of preventive controls over DNS because of the impact that it may have if it's done incorrectly or just mistakenly. And again, kind of more general, not specifically to DNS, but just doing data obfuscation, things like, base64 encoding and other types of scrambling of the bits and bytes. And then, protocol impersonation. So acting like the protocol, but kind of behaving abnormally in respect to that protocol. These are things that kind of fit within the MITRE ATT&CK framework relevant to DNS command and control. I'm not going to go through a lot of like the DNS protocol itself and all of the iterations and all the RFCs. There's tons of resources online to look into if you want to dive more into that. And obviously the time that we have in this presentation doesn't accommodate for that. But in a nutshell, we're kind of going to go over two broad based perspectives of DNS when it comes to DNS command and control. There's two types of ways you establish from a client perspective that's internal into your network for any internal system to an external system, from a pure general perspective of command and control, establishing that conduit, if you will, from an external entity to an internal entity and vice versa. There's really two ways to go about it. It boils down to anyways. One is direct DNS resolution. The other one is a recursive or chained DNS. And what we're looking at here first is direct DNS. So imagine you're in an environment and you're protecting all the entities below the red line, below the firewall. And you have clients and many clients doing DNS, right? If the firewall, the egress policy rules of that firewall, egress means outbound, right? So if those outbound rules allow either UDP or TCP port 53, or any port for that matter for DNS that the attacker may know about, if that traffic is allowed directly out, then the attacker can establish what we would refer to as direct DNS or direct DNS resolution. And so if that's something that's allowed in the environment, then it makes it very easy for the attacker to kind of pull off DNS command and control. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But if you look here, you have an internal resolver and you have this external resolver. In this, again, a very simplistic perspective, if DNS is allowed strictly outbound or straight outbound, then it bypasses your internal resolver, your external resolver, and goes straight to the attacker's command and control infrastructure. Conversely, if you like the other alternative, and this is the more secure alternative as far as for an architecture perspective, is not allowing any direct DNS out to anywhere in the world, right? So you would essentially have limitations and your egress firewall policies to only allow traffic that's leaving your environment to go to specific DNS resolvers. They're either in your control on the outside internet facing, or they're highly trusted, like something like your ISP, or say you're paid for another service that does your DNS resolution on the outside, that your firewall will strictly only allow traffic to those external resolvers. And that way it forces the attacker then to have to do a little bit more work to establish the command and control. It's not impossible, or we wouldn't be talking about it, but it does make the attack make it more difficult for the attacker to pull off. And so in that case, when we have this chained or recursive DNS architecture, then all that DNS traffic is then forced to go through to that and follow behave from a behavioral perspective, follow along a little bit more guidelines wise of how the DNS works, and so anything that you could do to kind of make it more difficult for the attacker, the better off you will be from a defensive perspective. But before we get there, and we haven't really talked about any like preventive solutions or strategies, you got to have visibility, right? You got to be able to monitor stuff in your environment to look for the stuff so you can detect it. And so if we can't see that, if we don't get the data, so if we're not centrally collecting to a SIM, or if we're not getting it from some other type of log source or entity, and then we're going to be blind to the activity. So before you can get started, you kind of have to strategically position your sensors or your traffic in a way in which you can collect it, you can analyze it, and look for that anomalous behavior. So from that perspective, and this is a slide that I use for other things, just a very general perspective of a traditional network where you have some kind of DMZ, an internal network, and maybe even subnets out there. And from this perspective, you have a single IPOP or internet point of presence to the internet. When you're talking about DNS specifically, if you place from a sensing perspective on your network, if you can find these strategic choke points and you can place your sensors there, you're going to have a better chance of catching this stuff. DNS specifically, in order for this to be successful and an external attacker to establish a command and control, that traffic has to leave your environment. And so the best place to be positioned to catch it from a general perspective would be as high up in this architecture as possible, as close to your internet choke point as possible. The downside with that in this type of solution, though, is that with things like network address translation and other things that can get obfuscated along the way. So you may be able to see the DNS traffic leaving your environment, but if you're positioned so high up in the internet or towards the internet, you may not be able to see the source of the originating source of that DNS traffic. So again, going back to that example where we're forcing the recursive DNS to happen, or forcing that to go through some internal resolver first, you're only going to see traffic from the internal resolver, essentially proxying that DNS traffic out, even though proxy is probably a bad term in this case, but essentially on behalf of the client is requesting that DNS connection or DNS question. And so that you may lose visibility into the originator if you're not closer to the actual source or client that's actually started the DNS traffic. So you want to think about that in how the best it would fit in your environment. Essentially, kind of brainstorm how that would work best for you. So kind of revisiting or recapping the difference between direct and recursive is that we have that. If we allow direct DNS, it makes it much easier for the attacker to pull off. If we require recursive or require traffic to go directly to DNS resolvers that are in control of you or in control of trusted entities, then it makes it a lot more difficult. So imagine the case here where like any traffic to either UDP or TCP outbound 53 could go anywhere in the world. then the attacker doesn't even need to own the domains. They don't have to be authoritative for any of the domains that they're using. From a network perspective, it may be very difficult to identify nefarious versus benign DNS traffic. All right. So again, showing that simple architecture here, bypassing internal resolvers, we can go straight to the threat actor's command and control infrastructure, and essentially makes the abuse a lot easier for the attacker. And then, forcing it through this recursive chained architecture makes it a lot more difficult. And I'm going to talk about some other things in a minute in respect to case sensitivity and some other things that are kind of inherently involved in the DNS protocol. And so once you're trying to kind of maximize what you can do to abuse that protocol through legitimate recursive DNS servers, your mileage may vary as far as for how far some of that data can travel. And we'll show you some of that in just a minute. So some of these campaigns, popular campaigns over time, tried to find ones that were more relevant within, say the last, year in a few years anyways. I highlighted Sunburst here. Sunburst was the malware used in the SolarWinds compromise. And there's countless and countless of resources here where we can go look to see how threat actors actually have abused DNS for command and control. And so the resources are here if you wanted to go and look at those articles and read all about that. A lot of these have leveraged, like I said, those record types like A records and the TXT records, and the ones that are at the top of the list. Almost all of these kind of leverage those top like 3 or 4 record types to pull off some of these campaigns that are referenced in these articles. And even though the protocol is very old and goes back to the 80s, it shows that this is still relevant today, right? So here's a look at the Sunburst malware reported by FireEye, and essentially, if you're familiar with SolarWinds, or if you haven't been and you've been maybe haven't been paying attention to the news in the last couple of years. Or just didn't really kind of dig into the actual details of what Sunburst did. The compromise of SolarWinds was a massive compromise, over 18,000 victims, but not 18,000 victims had command and control established. So that was kind of important. So what the malware did, the backdoor patch of SolarWinds did, was first of all lay low for a while. It was a couple of weeks before any activity kind of kicked off. Network-wise, which made it a lot more difficult to identify the source or how it started. But once the malicious code kind of did its thing and did its internal reconnaissance of where it was, it would establish this communications out via DNS and look very much like normal SolarWinds traffic generating DNS. Although I would kind of beg to differ that as far as if you looked hard at the DNS traffic and historically looked at your past SolarWinds DNS traffic, there probably would be huge differences. But aside from that, the malware actually used DNS, reached out in a certain way in which when the artifacts, or say when the ingredients were right for the environment that the threat actors wanted to target, they use the CNAME, which again is kind of like a pointer to another DNS record to say, hey, go here. And so that CNAME traffic only showed up when the environment variables were right in the way in which the threat actor wanted to target that internal network. And so then they use the CNAME to then redirect to the real malicious domains there that you see on the right. So that was, going, SolarWinds last year, huge compromise. Everybody was talking about it. Again, use DNSC2 to kind of establish those communications. But we know about these very popular tools, and this isn't all of the tools whatsoever, right? So I probably should have added a few more I know Sliver has pretty capable DNS-C2 in it as well. But the top three, I kind of separated these out. These were some of the ones that I've done research over the last several years, or used myself, whether on pen testing engagements or have actually seen threat actors using and responding as an incident responder, responding to a threat actor activity using some of these tools. So the top three are more associated with pure DNS or tunneling, right? So two-way communications. You have client-server communications. We talked about, but as far as for the flow of information, when we think about like data going outbound, data coming in, everything. These are essentially like tunneling capabilities, and the threat actor can establish that two-way communications. And anything in most of these tunnels can support additional protocols within those tunnels. The latter two there, Dns Ftp and Dns Exfiltrator, are more associated with actually transferring files or file transfers. Dns Ftp, very, very nice tool for downloading files. So if you're in an environment, say you're a pen tester, and you need to get data down into your environment, Dns Ftp is an extremely awesome tool to use and to just pull down data from your C2 infrastructure to the client that you're on. Dns Exfiltrator, conversely, is the opposite, right? You need to get data out, and you want to get it out as quickly as possible, even though DNS may not be the route that you would use for quick, but it might be your only route you have, right? And so Dns Exfiltrator is a tool that you can use to exfil data out. And we'll see some other techniques as well that kind of push the bounds of what has been considered normal. This is an example from Zelster's site showing what DNS cat traffic looks like. So you see, in this case, the activities using TXT records. But if you go read the sources in GitHub, you can see that DNS Cat 2 utilizes CNAMEs and MX records as well. One of my favorite tools, DNS FTP. So this tool, again, is used to download data. So this view that we're seeing here is kind of the viewpoint of the attacker's command and control infrastructure. You set up the server. Essentially, it's a Python script you run. You give it the parameter for the file that you want to stage for download. And then it does some calculation at the top here, where this payload.exe has 3,949 parts to that file, meaning that file gets broken up into 3,949 parts, meaning that you're going to have to, at least at a minimum, request this from a DNS request perspective. This traffic would show up from a root domain perspective, 3,949 times in your environment. And you can see here, we could see 0 of 3,949, 1 of 3,949, and so on and so forth. DNS FTP uses TXT records to transfer the data down. You can also see here where it says 0.cncserver.com and then 1.cncserver.com. That will iterate from 0 to 3948 until it gets to 3949 total packets required to transfer this particular file. So another technique that we've seen, or that can be used, is leveraging the labels themselves in the DNS record. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation the concept of DNS labels, and what we're looking at here in this capture is one of so the labels together. So you have 0 dot, and then this value dot, and then another value. So we're looking at a few labels that are within the host record name that's being transferred over. Using DNS A record types, we're seeing all this traffic go in one direction. And what it looks like, if you look closely enough, we could see the characters represent anywhere from 0 to 9, and really 0 through 9, and then A through F. So it looks at face value that this data is just hexadecimal data. And we'll actually show you a little bit more of a breakdown of this. But essentially, this is data that's forward lookups that are transferring out of the network, and then have this hexadecimal value in the DNS label. And this is a quick or just an example of a Python script that was used to create this. So a little bit of a history on this. I was actually on a pen testing engagement where I was in an environment that was extremely locked down, strictly locked down, did not allow direct DNS resolution, had to go through go through the internal recursive DNS architecture to get back to the command and control. Had a bunch of controls that were in place that made it very difficult to do much of anything when it comes to establishing that two-way communications. But I wanted to try to get some of this data, or at least simulate a data exfiltration. And the last alternative that I had was essentially whipping up this Python script. I was on a server that actually had Python already installed. So I whipped up this quick little Python script that used Nslookup to essentially take a file that was staged, break it up into pieces, take the actual hex value of the data into the DNS label, and then one by one chunks of the actual hexadecimal representation of the file were being sent out via these DNS for these labels. It took a really long time to do, but essentially it was successful to get the data out. So the other interesting part about this, which I'll show you in a minute, is that you don't need to wait for a response to come back. So these are kind of, again, UDP traffic, right? In order for this to work, even in the recursive mode, you do have to own or have control over that authoritative name server, whatever root domain that you're using. You have to have control over that if you're in that recursive mode. But in that sense, you don't even need to have a server listening on a port. You have a service listening on the port. You could just sniff the traffic coming in and just wait for these packets to come in. And since it's UDP, you can capture that traffic, and you essentially have the pieces of the file one by one as they come into your command and control server. So that takes us to case sensitivity. So if you kind of follow DNS abuse and some of these articles that were written either about threat actors or some of these articles that or resources for some of these DNS tools, you'll notice that lots of times base 32 gets used versus base 64 for encoding the data, which there's a reason for. Lots of times the concern is that things will break, right? From the attacker's perspective. Like they want to make sure that as these recursive queries are happening, that the intermediary DNS resolvers are not breaking the case of your of the DNS record, right? So if you switch to something like if you do something like base 64, you obviously have that concern of case being broken, because the case64 library contains, A through Z lowercase, but then A through Z uppercase, 0 through 9, and 2 special characters. And oh, by the way, that presents some issues too, because the DNS protocol only allows for one of those special characters, the dash, right? So all other characters are not allowed. So you have to do something where you either go to something like a base 58 or a base to get away from the special character requirement, or base 32, which just takes care of just all lowercase values. But in the RFC, it actually states that the original case shall be preserved. So if your intermediary resolvers are playing by the rules, they're supposed to keep the case of the DNS label or DNS labels or the record as that query occurs. And so if that's the case, no pun intended, then you could preserve that, and you can use that as a way to also communicate. So as far as when it comes to actually like establishing, so how can we leverage that as an attacker, right? So again, using base 64, we're leveraging it there. And again, this is applying in the DNS name, not the text records or anything like that. So going back to like Dns Ftp, where the data was coming down as text records, that could be the case is not going to matter for that. It should be preserved because it's just raw text coming down. But from a DNS record name or the labels themselves, that's what we're talking about in regards to the actual case. So you can't have a name, you can't register a name like google.com, all lowercase, and then I go register a name like Google with uppercase O's and L's and everything else is lowercase. that doesn't work, right? The case is not preserved in a way for ownership, but it should be preserved at all costs when storing or when actually transferring the data per the RFC. So look at this in a minute with some of our tools to see how that works. I'll show you some of that. But one of the ideas here is, what if you took a DNS record name, and so we have in this third bullet down, you could see the case is kind of going from lowercase to uppercase. And so what if we said that we treat all lowercase characters as zeros and all uppercase characters as ones? And in a sense, we can keep the same DNS record, right? And we can toggle the case of the values, and we can communicate in binary. So at the top, now this is a very, very slow way to communicate and establish command and control, or at least communicate information out. But if you look at the very top bullet, we have CD space C:/. So if we translate each one of those characters into their binary representation, you have that second bullet with all the ones and zeros. And then if we look at the third bullet, that the ones and zeros translates to uppercase, lowercase. And essentially doing this and maximizing out that record a little bit more, because this is just using 3 labels, 2 of which are reserved for the root domain. But we can maximize this out a little bit more and communicate binary communications outbound. What do our tools say about all this stuff? One of the things that I have a very strong passion doing is that kind of identifying, and it kind of hits hard too, as being a defender for most of my career, is not getting too dependent or reliant on the tools that we have. Tools are great, and some tools are better than other tools, but kind of understanding your limitations of what those tools are kind of helps you be a better defense, right? If you know where your gaps are, if you know where your tools fall short, then you can either come up with new strategies to shore up those gaps, minimize those gaps and just be aware of that, right? The last thing you need is more false negatives in your environment where you think you're okay, but you have some type of threat activity going on that you're entirely blind to. So that brings me to 2 of my favorite tools, but also some of the, emotional roller coaster that I have with these tools, right? So Sysmon and Zeek, formerly Bro IDS, are great tools to have. Specifically, they cost very little, right? Only your time and resources to make them work in your environment. They're both free tools to use, right? They're great. They give us great visibility, but also when they come out with some great features, and you're like, "Wow, this is awesome! This is the best thing. This is what we needed." And then you find out that they're not doing something in one of those areas, and you're like, "Come on!" Right? So the frustrations, right? And this is a relationship with these tools more than anything. But it's kind of one of the things I wanted to highlight specifically with DNS. So Sysmon, again, I love Sysmon. Sysmon's been a great tool ever since it's been released in the sysinternal suite in version 10, I believe. Yep, right here. So version 10, they introduced event 22, which it basically captures in this. If you read this and you read the docs, it's essentially it generates an event when the process executes DNS query, whether the result is successful or fails or cached or not, which is not entirely true. In fact, it's a flat out lie in some cases that Sysmon does not do this for everything. So if you are using Sysmon in your environment as your only solution or your biggest solution to try to catch nefarious or evil DNS activity, you may want to at least look in different areas other than event ID 22. So here's an example. We can ping. We use the ping command, king.www.blackhills.com. We could see Sysmon event 1, the process execution, where we see that ping command executed. Then we see associated with that, right after that, we see event 22, which captured the query and the result. So that's fantastic, right? So now we use Nslookup. So we use Nslookup, and we have process execution or process creation event 1, right? That shows us we use Nslookup to do a lookup on www.blackhills.com, but there's no event 22 activity. And this is true for any time you use Nslookup in your environment. So sysmon does not capture event 22 activity for utilizing Nslookup. And it kind of, I scratched my head on this for a while before when I first discovered this and why, right? And so the only thing I could find was essentially the way that the sysmon is hooking the events. It's really looking for applications that are using DNS as a resolution to then connect to something else, right? So Nslookup is just asking a question, querying a domain name to get a result back, and just getting the result back. Whereas the event 22 is really just capturing things like your browser or other applications that are performing a DNS query in order to get an answer, then subsequently connect to whatever over IPv4 or IPv6 to that whatever the answer was. And so if again, this is the normal behavior of sysmon. However, you're not entirely blind to it, because if somebody was running some type of Nslookup utilities and kind of recursive, or just running them and trying to establish command and control with Nslookup, you would at least have the process creation events as well. So just be aware of that. And then it brings me to Zeek, right? So Zeek, and I'll show you here in a minute. I'll jump into we'll just show you live. We only have a few more minutes left of the presentation. So, and so if we run Zeek on this packet capture, it'll generate our traditional Zeek log. So we'll get a con log. We know we have DNS traffic in there. So if we look at the DNS activity that's captured by Zeek, we can see where the record abcdf.0-byte.com gets captured. If we cut out all the unique iterations of that domain, we get 1. However, if we look at this in Wireshark, we'll see that there's actually more than just one unique iteration of that domain if you treat case correctly. So if we see we have uppercase A there, and then it goes on to B, and then C, and so on and so forth. So what's going on? Well, so what Zeek is doing is actually taking the record that's being queried, and it lowercases it to log it. And I don't know why they're doing that, other than maybe just for the benefit of not creating as much data. But that's just what it does. So just kind of being aware. Now, Zeek does understand the original case value, and there's a way in which you could modify Zeek to capture the original case that was queried. That's something that I actually go through in the class that I teach for network forensics, and that we kind of go through Zeek and kind of understand how we can get the most out of that tool specifically, and kind of just tweaking and making a slight modification to our local.zeek and a custom Zeek script where we essentially add a column to the DNS log, where then we would get the visibility captured of the case. And that's what we're seeing here. If you use this dump events.zeek script, this is a debugging script that Zeek has, where you can see here, Zeek is taking this data and putting it into an array. This first query array is the one that gets lowercased, but the fifth element here, this original query string, contains the original case of what was seen over the wire. And in case you didn't realize already, that screen that showed the picture at the top was from Rogue One. And when I saw this movie and basically the plans of the Death Star got exfiltrated out from this tower, I kind of looked at it as like the biggest data exfil in the history of the galaxy. But I guess they didn't have a DLP in place or anything else to catch it. So where do you go from there? So your choke points are critical, right? Monitor your choke points. Don't be reliant on, your clients. Don't be reliant on your endpoints if that's what you're doing, right? DNS is something, in order for a command and control to be established, it has to go out, right? It has to go externally. So leverage those critical choke points where you can get that activity, where you're postured to capture that activity, because for it to be successful, it has to traverse those choke points. So do that in a way in which, you have that visibility, and also be wary that if you go too far, you may lose the visibility of that originator that's querying it, right? That might not be a bad idea, because at least you have visibility, and then maybe you have to do some more research or pivoting internally to then find what are those internal clients that are initiating that connection, but at least you would have visibility. And then utilizing things like application proxy firewalls that aren't just aware of ports and protocols, or IP addresses and ports, but are actually application protocol aware and cognizant, and do the deep packet inspection, like Zeke does for logging. But from a firewall perspective, you could leverage some of these solutions. There's OpenDNS, which is free for non-commercial use. And then Cisco obviously bought OpenDNS. There's an enterprise solution that they have as well called Umbrella that provides a lot of that oversight capability that you can leverage. Although it does cost money, it's not free. And then honestly, as your recap, just understand your environment, understand the protocols of your environment, understand what normal is in your environment. We talked about record types. You can start there, right? If you have visibility like Zeke, that's great. Start doing things like data stacking, right? What are our clients? How are they asking for these records? What are the record types that are being queried? Look for anomalous record types that kind of stick out, right? Start somewhere where you have that frequency of least occurrence, and then pivot from there. But most importantly, know your tools, know those limitations, because then when you're responding, you at least know to not fall victim of that false negative stuff. That could definitely happen, and it happens with all tools. Like there's nothing that's 100% perfect, but just know those limitations. Come up with strategic, some strategies to close the gaps as best as possible. And with that, I think I'm all set. Again, I mentioned I'm teaching a class next week. It's not too late to sign up if this is kind of something that you want to dig harder into. We go through this a lot. It's not just DNS, but abuse of HTTP, abuse of some of the other common protocols, ICMP, that are common within IT networks. How to respond to them, how to adapt, how to come up with creative solutions to counter some of these things, or just understand exactly what's going on in your environment.
Hi, Troy.
That, Jason, I think I'm all set.
Okay, Troy. No, you did good. A lot. I'm not used to the emojis that are popping up here, and
yeah,
so,
I saw that too at the last minute.
There's like that, you're all there and you're validating us. Thank you so much. We did have a couple questions. Here's one: if case doesn't matter for DNS, how are threat actors using Cyrillic letters such as the Cyrillic, the A, and so forth in phishing DNS attacks?
So like non-ASCII, is that?
This is Unicode, so internationalized domain names. Yeah,
like the pony code or whatever. Yeah. So I mean that's something so that's what happens like when so case does matter. I guess that's the moral of the story. Case really does matter. I thought I made that kind of clear, but
yeah, I thought you made it.
Okay.
Just going back to it. Okay. What's the point of using CNAME records that all points to the same domain for an attack, as you shown in the first slides? Why not using the pointed domain directly?
So kind of synonymous to I know it's not one for one. There's a little bit difference when we talk about like URL shorteners and stuff like that. But at least with CNAMEs, you can change the backend domain, right? So you can keep the CNAME. And then change the backend domain. Kind of helps too with caching as well. So you could kind of get around that as well.
Yeah. And I encourage you to make the name of this presentation, How to Abuse DNS for Command and Control. And someone's like, get to it. Did you, during this presentation, talk about how to abuse DNS, or was it coming from the IR perspective since you've been abusing DNS for so long?
It's a little bit of both. I think, how threat actors have abused DNS more so, and then how as defenders we can see that activity and respond to that activity.
Yeah. And since you've been an attacker and a defender and an IR person, like how is all of that meshed together for the IR work that you do?
So one thing I didn't mention, in the presentation, which I probably should have, but from an IR perspective, like one of the first dance moves that I always do is look for DNS. Like when I get in an environment or say you're responding to an incident, DNS is one of the biggest things. Obviously, we look for those atomic indicators like IP addresses and things like that. DNS almost always leads to that. It's that X on the map, right? Well, it's not so much the X, but it's leading you those steps to where you can find some of that. If an attacker wants to not use DNS to establish external communications, fair enough. I actually applaud it because we kind of refer to that as like raw IP. They can do that, but that tends to stick out even more than DNS does, right?
Do me a favor and end sharing your presentation so that way our cameras go full screen. And then that way, if there are any other questions, feel free to ask them at any time. Will the training courses of Wild West Hack and Fest be posted soon? I think so. Not quite sure. I think they're still working out which classes they'll be. Gary wants to know, what about use of DNS over HTTPS and other new transport methods for DNS?
Yeah. So, that's a good thing. That's a good question. I would say if you're in an environment, like an enterprise environment, I would say use a proxy and be in control of your own domain. And when I say domain, I don't mean like the domain you own internally. I mean your entity, your network. That's your network. I would recommend use a intercepting web proxy and have that proxy do the DNS lookups and not some browser doing on behalf of you, right? I know that there's some good with it. There is a lot of good with it, privacy concerns and such. But if we're talking about securing your enterprise, you're in control of this. This is your data, and so. Yeah, somebody just mentioned TLS 1.3. I think you're referring to the SNI, the server name indicator field. I think maybe that's what that comment was. But I can pause if that was the comment there.
Yeah, and I know that Kyle Avery has done some research on using DNS over HTTPS for like Cobalt Strike. So it's definitely
it's relevant.
Yeah, absolutely relevant. And like you said, privacy aside, you're in an enterprise, and typically your EULA says you have no right to privacy when we're using your computer. So you should have, something to help protect yourself.
Yeah. And that's how I feel my own network, right? This is my network and my data. And I understand that, it's for privacy, but there's definitely, in the world of data analytics and data and information, there's definitely use cases that these browsers have or advantages that the browsers have to understanding what you're actually using DNS for.
Yeah. Any thoughts on internal wildcard DNS records for your domain and mitigations?
The wildcard for like your certificates?
I guess we'll wait for clarity. While we're waiting for clarity, how advanced is your training? I felt like a noob looking at some of the slides.
All right. So, so it starts off like 1 to 2 years of experience is what I say, starting off. If you've used Wireshark before, if you've opened up Wireshark, you kind of I have an idea of what IP addresses are and what ports are, a rough understanding of the OSI model, things like that. I don't use the word advanced in my class. So it is network forensics, but I purposely didn't use the word advanced because first of all, I think there's no like easy forensics or no like starting forensics is a subject that is difficult. I started off where if you use Wireshark before, or just you're familiar with those concepts of the OSI model and things like that, you'll get through the course. The hands-on labs actually walk you through it step by step. I actually go through it afterwards too. I give the students the opportunity to do the labs. And then there's a guide that they can go do on their own. And then I actually walk through it as well, manually, and then answer questions that way. So it's really geared for both ends of the spectrum. It does get a little bit more advanced towards the end, but it definitely kind of, has room for all those different skill sets.
And Fletch, can you add on to that question I asked earlier? The wildcard. Yeah.
So what Ricardo is asking is essentially an attacker can create a wildcard DNS record, so star.domainname.com, to try to steer your traffic. I think the mitigation there would be monitoring dynamic DNS updates, right? I can't just do that. Yeah. There has to be a mechanism for me to do it. So like sure. Active Directory integrated DNS, I might be able to do something like that. But I kind of got to keep my arms around it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it depends on the scenario, right? Like if we have to go recursively, then we have to own the root domain. It doesn't really matter if you have wildcards in there or whatsoever, right? Like aside from the toggling of the case, if you want to transmit data, you're going to have tons and tons and tons of individual DNS records. So really looking for that is going to be key.
Yeah, that I think on an engagement that I was on, moving like a 1 meg file was like 60,000 DNS requests. So that becomes horribly obvious when you're making requests for a domain that's not something that your users are typically using. And it's going to dwarf the number of requests that you see for everything else, really. Yeah. Outside of like big things like Microsoft.com.
Sure. Yeah. And that's the other thing too, is like if you have direct DNS access, so if you don't have that egress filtering on your firewall, to where you could just go straight to a command and control server, you can use any domain you want. You could use Microsoft.com and Google.com because you're not actually abiding by that recursive chain. And if you were just looking at it from a network perspective, you're like, oh, that's Google or Akamai or Microsoft. And it probably wouldn't even, and then, I didn't mention either, but AV vendors. So antivirus vendors, if you have any type of EDR or AV and you're trying to find this anomalous DNS activity, they most likely will definitely stick out. You have this communication leaving your environment already in that regards.
All right, Troy, any final words today before we wrap up?
No, just thanks for everybody for coming out and hanging out, and hope you learned something. And if anytime, hit me up on one of the resources, LinkedIn or anything else. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. My final thoughts of this. Last week at Way West, we had the Wild West Hacking Fest in San Diego, and all the conversations around the con were like this, where you got a chance to talk to each other and everybody was back and forth and sharing knowledge, and it was fantastic. And if you want to join us at Deadwood in October, we'd love to have you. So Wild West Hacking Fest in Deadwood. And lastly, if you need a pen test, red team, threat hunt, ActiveSOC, incident response services, you know where to find us. And we'll see y'all next time. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye.